We're ready to begin our Bible class tonight. Thank you for being here tonight. Previously, in John chapter 18, you remember we studied about how Jesus was arrested in the garden and he was drug away, taken away, led away to the high priest's house, and Annas or Caiaphas. And Caiaphas hadn't really been the high priest very long. Annas had been deposed, but anyway, there was some confusion about who the real high priest was. But still, Jesus ended up that night being cross-examined or questioned by both of them. John does not record all 7 of the hearings that Jesus had during that night. He leaves out about 3 of them as he tells his story, but he mentions the others. And he mentions that he went over to that house and he was first brought to Annas and then finally to Caiaphas. And then after he leaves from there, he goes to Pilate, but he doesn't mention about him going to Herod, and just some omission there that's not like this fault. It's just that he's telling a different thread of the story. But I want to pick up tonight reviewing where we were as we began to look in on some disciples that went into enemy territory when John went back and got Peter after he had gone on in because he knew the high priest family and the gatekeeper girl admitted him. He went back and got Peter and brought him in, and as he was coming in, you remember what happened about that? Simon Peter followed Jesus, so did another disciple, and since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus, and then, like we were just saying, Peter is left outside at the door. So John goes back. He modestly refers to himself in the third person, the other disciple. He went out and spoke to the servant girl, kept watch at the door, who's going to be Peter's first inquisitor. And she brings Peter in, and the servant girl keeping the door says, "You're not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" And just like Jesus told him he would do, and Peter denied it and said, "If I have to die, I'll never deny you." But when that big, scary little girl that was keeping the gate said, "You're not a disciple, are you?" He said, "I am not." I understand being outnumbered and being pressured, and I'm not mocking Peter at all. How many times have I caved under pressure to not say and not do the right thing? Now tonight we pick it up at verse 18. Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. This is the first week in April of AD 30, and it's cold in the morning, and they're standing outside around a fire trying to get warm or stay warm. And what an interesting assortment of people standing around that fire. There's some soldiers. Those are probably temple guard officers, probably not Roman soldiers in there. But either way, the authorities, the armed ones, and the servants of the high priest's house are out there, and some disciples are there. Peter and John, at least we know Peter is because John tells us that Peter was also with them, standing and warming himself. I've heard preachers talk about this all my life, I guess. Heard them talk about how this is an example of how you get with the wrong crowd and you get in trouble. And I suppose there is some truth to that. But Peter was in there. There are some others that ran away from the garden. Peter and John were in there. And Peter was going to do what Jesus knew in advance and told him in advance he was going to do. But it hasn't happened yet, except that first little skirmish there at the door where he made that little denial to that young lady. Meanwhile, over in the quarters of the high priest, he questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Now, this is an odd thing for them to do. This is probably, like a fishing expedition, like attorneys sometimes do when they're asking questions in court. Just casting around and seeing by asking questions if you can get a witness to incriminate or perjure himself. And it's an old tactic, and see, it's at least 2,000 years old. That's what the high priest is doing here. They knew all about his teaching. They had been listening for over 3 years. They knew all about his disciples. They had been watching them. They had been spying on them. They had mingled in with them over the last 3 years in a lot of crowds. There were folks from their party there with Jesus and the disciples, taking reports back and forth and getting offended when Jesus would say something that they called blasphemy, or getting really offended when they saw Jesus and his disciples associating with known sinners, like that old stinking Zacchaeus and that woman at Simon Pharisee's house and others that Jesus associated with whom they disapproved. They knew all about his disciples. They knew all about his teaching. And Jesus answers. He says, I have spoken openly to the world. This is not a secret society. I have always taught in synagogues, in a public assembly of our people, to those fellow Jews, and in the temple where all Jews come together. I've not said anything in secret. So that question was really kind of inappropriate, and it kind of shows how very threadbare and thin the case they were trying to make against Jesus was when he opens with something like that. And Jesus goes on, why do you ask me? Ask those among you guys, who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. Will you admit it? Ask old Nicodemus. Nicodemus knows what I said, but I didn't think they want to hear it from Nicodemus. They knew. It wasn't they were ignorant. I know Peter will later in the sermon say, I know that you did it in ignorance. He didn't understand the scheme. I mean, those Jews didn't understand the scheme by which God was going to redeem the world, but they knew exactly who Jesus had said he was in language all but what they could use against him to take him to the Romans. They knew what he had said. They knew who the disciples were. And when he had said these things, which was sort of like a mild rebuke to them for what they were saying and doing, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, is that how you answer the high priest? Now, this reminds you a little bit of something that happened one time when Paul was being defended in the book of Acts. Paul genuinely did not know that he was the high priest. He'd been out of town a long time, and he didn't know that the guy who was sitting there was the high priest. But that's not the case with Jesus. Jesus knew perfectly well who it was, but he didn't say anything but what was right. He only said what was right, and this was the beginning of, well, I doubt that probably started in the garden, but in John's record, this is the beginning of the abusive mistreatment and mockery and insulting and making fun of Jesus, making him the object of their scorn and the butt of their jokes. It begins by striking him across the face with his hand, saying, is that how you answer the high priest? And Jesus simply made the statement, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? It's a pointed question. They had no case. Nothing Jesus said was out of line. He was just stating the facts of the situation to them, and he had no right, that officer had no right to smite Jesus for saying so. Jesus is calm. Isn't this interesting? This storm is brewing all around him. The hatred, the venom that's flowing is deep and thick and intense. But Jesus is remarkably calm under the pressure. In the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and here in John, it is the composure of Jesus under this intense pressure that just testifies so much about him being completely submitted to the Father, not defending himself, not lashing out, not calling down legions of angels to get these guys, just patiently bearing it like Isaiah saw that he would, like a lamb before his shearers is mute, and the sheep before the slaughter are silent. That's how Jesus was responding here. Annas, that was supposed to be the high priest, then sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest, who was the one that had been deposed and father-in-law was going to handle it, because he was a long-standing, and a lot of the Jews still counted him the high priest because the Romans had appointed that son-in-law. And so here he is at another hearing, just in front of a different fellow, marching him around that household. And now Simon Peter, meanwhile, back out in the courtyard, is standing by that fire and warming himself. And then, we're not sure exactly who or how many, but they, some of the people around, said, "You also are not one of his disciples, are you?" And he denied it again and said, "I am not." I really do understand. Let's not be so hard on Peter. He had a spectacular failure. And when we have failed in a public way, and it is widely known that we have, those things are painful and hard, and you would avoid them if you could. And Peter is doing something that he's going to regret and remember with tears, probably for the rest of his life. But under the pressure of the moment, he denies it and says, "I am not." However, there's a problem now. It's not just a one-servant girl, but it's a group of people, and there was an eyewitness to what Peter did. And that eyewitness, who was a servant, a high priest, but was a cousin or a kinsman to the man that Peter had performed the earectomy on out in the garden, when he whacked off the guy's ear. He said, "Didn't I see you in the garden with him?" John doesn't say this, but the synoptics do, that Peter denied it with an oath. But John just says, Peter again denied it, and at once the most famous rooster in all of history crowed. The one that Jesus said would sound off to confirm to Peter that before that rooster crowed, "You'll deny me 3 times. I wonder how that rooster sounded to Peter. Don't you? And the realization of what he had done, how boastful he had been, how wrong he was about himself, and how ashamed he would be in so short a time as to go back on a sacred, solemn vow that he would never forsake his Lord. He would die before he did. And he did it 3 times in that evening. Aren't you glad there's not a record being kept that we know of when we have done something probably pretty similar, just not on such a big stage and not preserved for all of the rest of time to know about? But when Peter denied it again, the rooster crowed. I imagine it all came crashing in on Peter. And if it didn't, that look that comes up a little bit later in some of the other accounts, when the Lord turns right after that rooster crows and looks from the place where he's over here in Caiaphas' quarters, being questioned, being grilled by his enemies, he turns and looks at his friend Peter, who's just denied him 3 times. And when their eyes met, Peter goes out and weeps bitterly. It's a sad night. It's a sad thing that happened there with Peter's 3 denials. Anybody have a question or comment about what Peter did that night? Have any idea about why? Anything you want to say about that? Anybody? Okay. Verse 28. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yes. Yes, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And that are grouped together like that and called that because they tell essentially the same progression of some variation, but essentially the same storyline. And then John is different. John is some different episodes, but it all leads to the same place in all 4 of them, to the cross and to the empty tomb. But John stands apart from those, and the others are called synoptics. So that's right. Anybody else?
Yeah, he denied in the 3 synoptics and in here as well. But Matthew's account, chapter 26, the girl says, "Are you one of him?" He said, "I do not know the man."
I do not know him.
Then again, 2 verses later, with an oath,
Yeah.
He said with an oath, I
Yeah.
do not know the man.
Yeah.
Now, what's that any different from just denying it or not? But it makes an impact
Yeah.
if you would go that far.
Right. He was out on a limb and was in trouble. And how many times would a whole lot of us cave just like that? And if we say, not me, I never would, you better remember that's exactly what Peter said before he did. Now, we're ready, I think, if I can get where I'm trying to be here. Yeah. Well, I keep going the wrong way. That's not very impressive, is it? So, 28. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas, which is, I think, the same place they led him. I think it was a great big house. And Annas and his family over here, might have been some others around then. Caiaphas is over here. And they lead him to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. Don't you suspect that Pilate was so glad to hear that they were at the gate? I imagine he was not very glad. I don't imagine this interview got off to a very good start. But it's early in the morning. This isn't the 9 o'clock hearing with the sentencing. This is when they first take Jesus to Pilate. Now, these Jews that brought Jesus would not go into the governor's headquarters. They didn't want to be defiled. They didn't want to be ceremonially unclean that evening at sundown when they could eat the Passover, the high holy observance ritual of the nation of Israel. And they had a ceremonial law about Jews not going into Gentiles' houses. Now, we'll lie about a man. We will be accessories to his murder, but that won't defile us like walking into a Gentile's house would. What a disgusting hypocrisy. That's not that unusual among hyper-religious folks who are sticklers for form and ritual and do not take it home with them and live it out in their everyday lives. It's not that uncommon. But these guys stand out in such a way when it's the Lord Jesus and his life that's on the line. We're not going to defile ourselves. We need Pilate to come out here because we want this guy dead. No, we know he didn't really do any of the crime, but we're going to talk about, but we need him dead, but we don't want to be defiled. So, Governor Pilate, we need you to come out here on the porch and talk to us. So Pilate went outside, and he said, what accusation do you bring against this man? What are the charges? Why are you here? Now, I wonder like if his hair was stood up in the mornings like mine did, but he said, why are you here? And look what they say. Verse 30. They answered him, if this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. Well, that's rather nebulous, isn't it? The question was, what did he do? What's the charge? They said, trust us. If he weren't doing bad, we wouldn't have brought him over here. And Pilate would have none of it. Pilate was shrewd. Pilate was not a nice person. History reveals him as a bad person, an evil man. But he saw right through the idea of what these Jewish leaders were up against of when they were taking on Jesus. And look what Pilate does. He badgers them through this whole time. He says, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. And then the Jews start getting closer to the point. Remember when John says the Jews, he's not talking about nationally, he's talking about the leaders of the Jews. And they say, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. We need to put an asterisk after that and say, they forgot this when they got so mad at Stephen, they threw rocks at him until he died. They forgot it in the riot at Jerusalem when they tried to kill Paul, tear him limb from limb. The Romans had to come and rescue him out of it. Sometimes they forgot about that. They needed this one done sort of by the book, and they wanted to make sure that it was Pilate that did it. They didn't even know exactly why it had to be that way. But there's an interesting thing about that coming up in just a line or two. But Pilate wouldn't have any of this excuse making, and here's his first attempt to get away from being guilty for the blood of Jesus. He's not dumb. He knows The Romans had excellent intelligence about Jesus. They knew what he said. They knew where he went. They knew what he did. And they knew there wasn't anything about it. He was no insurrectionist. He was no seditious person. He was not trying to get Caesar off the throne and take over the Jews and get them out from under. He wasn't doing any of that, and they knew that. But the Jews want him dead. They don't want to say why just yet, but Pilate's going to make them tell why when he gets them in the hearing in just a little while. And he says, this was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. This is a reference to, I think it's in Matthew 20, where Jesus, for the first time, it's the third time he's talked about his coming death, but it's the first time he says it's going to be at the hand of the Gentiles. That the Gentiles are going to be the ones who flip the switch, who put Jesus to death. The Roman soldiers, by command of Pilate the governor, are going to do it. And Jesus had predicted it that way, and this is all playing out. Whether the Jews meant for it or not doesn't really matter. They surely didn't mean to fulfill what Jesus said. They were just trying to get it done the way they wanted it done. But Jesus knew and said in advance how he was going to die at the hands of the Gentiles. And so this prophecy is going to come true. So Pilate goes into his headquarters again, and this time he convenes a formal hearing in the praetorium. And he says, are you the king of the Jews? Aha. The Jews either had finally admitted by making up a charge against Jesus that he was leading an insurrection, he was proclaiming himself king, and Caesar wouldn't like that, and you better not like it, Pilate. But anyway, Pilate's question was straight to Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus, as he sometimes did, answered a question with a question. Do you say this of your own account, or did others say it to you about me? Big difference in those things, isn't there? They said it. I mean, Pilate said that. But Jesus wanted to know, wanted Pilate maybe to do a little self-searching. Are you asking that because you're interested, or are you just repeating what somebody else has told you? Jesus is like a really good attorney in this. He doesn't ask a question that he doesn't already know the answer to. He very well knows the answer before he turns around and responds to Pilate's question with a question of his own. And Pilate said, am I a Jew? And that almost has a sense of a declarative. I am not a Jew, and proud of it. Your own nation and the chief priest have delivered you over to me. The highest authorities of your people, including their religious leaders, have brought you in here charging you with something. And they say you're talking about being a king, which was, that was the politically charged line to make sure they got a hearing. Because Caesar wanted no uprisings. He wanted no rival. He was emperor over the whole world as they viewed it. And he wanted no upstarts trying to get any of his empire. And so Pilate's just saying, what have you done, Jesus? Why are they so mad at you that they're in here on these trumped up charges against you? And Jesus answers and further explains his being king. My kingdom, which implies, I am a king. My kingdom is not of this world. It's not like Rome. It's not like Babylon. It's not like the Medes and the Persians and the Greeks that have gone before y'all got here. My kingdom is not of this world. And he says, here's how you could tell that. Now, if my kingdom were of this world, where, you conquer by the sword, and my servants would have been fighting. They would have fought you tooth and nail rather than give up their leader out there in the garden, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. He says, that shows you right off the bat. This kingdom is not from this world. This may have been stretching Pilate's mind and concept awareness about as far as it could go. Pilate says, so you are a king. You're talking about your kingdom, so you are a king. And here's Jesus coming very close to what the Jews were looking for him to say. You say that I am a king. And then this is like acknowledgement. For this purpose I was born. I am the Messiah that the Old Testament scriptures, that the scriptures prophesied. I am the one who was born for this very purpose. I've come into the world to bear witness to the truth that I am God in the flesh, that I am the promised Messiah. Now, Pilate is not going to get every bit of that, if any of it. And Jesus ends that statement by saying, everyone who is of the truth, and Pilate was not. And these Jewish leaders were not. But Jesus says, everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice, which really circles back around and answers the first question. Tell us about your teaching and about your disciples. Well, my disciples are the people that listen to truth, the truth that I've been telling. That's the teaching. And my disciples are the ones who listen to me. Jesus has been the most artful, and I don't mean that in a negative way, I mean a very complimentary way. Jesus has been so perfect word for word in what he said in these examinations before the Sanhedrin and now here before Pilate, before those high priests, calmly saying all that is right and saying nothing that was wrong. And after he says that remark about the truth, Pilate says this, and then we'll have to stop here tonight. Pilate says, what is truth? That means one of two things. Can you think of one way and then another way that Pilate might have meant that when he asked, what is truth? You think about that. And we'll come back there at verse 38. We'll finish chapter 18 and get to the dark, dark story of chapter 19, beginning at our next Wednesday night Bible study. But for tonight, that's all our time. YouTube folks, thank you for watching. We'll be back Sunday morning at 10:30. It's Friends and Family Day. Everybody come, Bible study 9:30, 10:30 morning worship. Bring lots of food, 11:45 lunch, 1 o'clock devotional, and then dismiss for the day by about 1:30. We hope you will be here. We hope you'll bring folks with you. We hope that you will have a great day with us as we have Friends and Family Day this coming Sunday. But for tonight, thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Good night.